The cabin wasn't supposed to attract attention. That was the whole point of it. Tucked low into the valley, half hidden by pine and rock, it had been there longer than most of the paved roads above it. No bright paint. No fence lines screaming ownership. Just weathered wood, a gravel pull-off, and the sound of wind moving through trees that didn't care who claimed what. I'd owned it for years. Not as a getaway. Not as a rental. As a place that simply existed, legally, quietly, and without interference. Until one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I ignored it. Bad reception was normal out there. Missed calls happened. People who needed me knew how to reach me properly. The second call came less than a minute later. Then a third. I answered on the fourth. "Is this the owner of the cabin down in Willow Valley?" a woman asked, voice tight, already irritated. "Yes," I said. "Who's calling?" "This is about your structure," she replied. "You can't just build wherever you want." I looked out the cabin window at the tree line, trying to understand how we'd skipped several steps in the conversation. "It's not new," I said. "And it's permitted." She scoffed. "That's not what I was told." I asked who told her that. She didn't answer. Instead, she launched into a complaint about noise, about safety, about how the cabin made her uneasy. She said it didn't fit the character of the area, that it lowered property values, that people like me didn't consider how our choices affected the rest of the valley. That phrase caught my attention. "The rest of the valley," I repeated. "Yes," she said sharply. "The community." There it was. The word people use when they want ownership without paperwork. "This isn't part of a community," I said calmly. "It's privately held land." She laughed, not amused, not kind. Dismissive. "Well, that's not how it works here," she said. "Everything down there falls under shared oversight." I didn't argue. Arguing teaches people they're close to being right. I told her the cabin was compliant, inspected, and documented with the county. I told her if she had concerns, she could direct them through the proper channels. "I already have," she said. "And if you don't address this immediately, I'll be calling the authorities." That made me pause. "On what grounds?" I asked. "You're trespassing," she said without hesitation. I looked down at the deed folder on the table, the same one I kept there for reasons exactly like this. "I own the land," I said. "All of it." Silence. Then, "We'll see about that." The line went dead. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I'd learned long ago that people who threaten to call the police are usually more interested in being heard than being correct. Still, I stepped outside and walked the perimeter. The cabin sat exactly where the survey markers said it did. The access road followed the easement that had existed for decades. Nothing had changed except someone's awareness of it. 20 minutes later, a patrol car crested the ridge above the valley. Then another. Lights flashing against trees that hadn't seen that color in a long time. I leaned against the cabin railing and waited. Because somewhere up there, a woman was convinced she'd just summoned authority. And down here, in the valley, she thought she understood. The truth was about to settle in, slowly, thoroughly, and without any need for raised voices. The officers stepped out of their vehicles and started down the path. And that's when the situation finally became real. The officers took their time walking down the path. That told me everything I needed to know. No urgency. No weapons drawn. Just two uniforms moving carefully through uneven ground, scanning the cabin, the tree line, the access road. This wasn't a raid. It was a response to a complaint, probably one wrapped in a lot of certainty and very little fact. They stopped a few yards from the porch. "Afternoon," one of them said. "We got a call about an unauthorized structure." I nodded. I figured. The second officer looked past me, eyes tracing the roofline, the supports, the way the cabin sat into the slope like it belonged there. He didn't see chaos. He saw age. "How long's it been here?" he asked. "Longer than both of us," I said. That earned the smallest smile. Before either of them could ask more, footsteps crunched on gravel behind us. She arrived like she'd been rehearsing it. Boots too clean for the trail. Sunglasses perched high. Phone in hand, camera already angled just enough to record. She stopped beside the officers and pointed at the cabin like she was presenting evidence. "That's it," she said. "That's the illegal one." I noticed she never said mine. She launched into her version immediately, how she'd noticed suspicious activity, how the cabin had appeared suddenly, how no one had consulted the valley homeowners. That phrase again. "Valley homeowners," the officer repeated. "Yes," she said. "We all have a stake in what happens down here." I let her talk. People reveal more when they think they're educating authority. "This land is environmentally sensitive," she continued. "There are shared access concerns. And frankly, I don't recognize him." She nodded toward me. The officer turned to me. "Sir, can you tell us about the property?" I gestured toward the valley. "All of it is privately owned. Broken into parcels, sure, but under one title." Her head snapped toward me. "That's not true." I met her gaze. "It is." She laughed again, louder this time. "You can't just say you own a valley." "I didn't say it," I replied. "The county did." That was the first time one of the officers' expressions shifted. "Do you have documentation?" he asked. I did. I stepped inside, retrieved the folder, and brought it back out. Deeds. Surveys. Easements. Decades of boring, undeniable paperwork. I handed it over. The officer flipped through slowly. Meanwhile, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling furiously. "I have messages," she said. "Emails. From the association." "What association?" the officer asked. She hesitated. "The informal one." The officer paused. "Ma'am, is there an HOA here?" "No," she said quickly. "Not officially." "That matters," he replied. Her confidence wavered. "This area has always been managed collectively," she insisted. "Everyone knows that." "Knowing isn't the same as owning," the officer said. "I still own my paperwork." The second officer stepped aside and radioed in the parcel number. The valley was quiet again. Wind through trees. A bird somewhere above us. The woman crossed her arms, jaw tight. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "He shouldn't even be here." The officer looked up from the documents. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "he's exactly where he's allowed to be." Her face flushed. "I called you because he's trespassing," she said. "You're supposed to do something." The officer nodded. "We are." He handed the folder back to me. And then he turned toward her. "Let's talk about your property next," he said. The color drained from her face. She hadn't expected that. And the valley, which she thought belonged to everyone, was about to teach her a very specific lesson about paperwork, ownership, and assumptions. The officer's words landed harder than he probably intended. "Let's talk about your property next." She blinked. "My property?" "Yes," he said, already pulling out his tablet. "You mentioned shared oversight. That usually means boundaries matter." Her posture shifted. Not defensive yet, just unsettled. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said. "I'm not the one trespassing." The officer didn't respond immediately. He entered a parcel number from my documents, then swiped through layers of maps. Contour lines. Easements. Ownership blocks. The second officer stood closer now, watching both of us, not suspiciously, just observantly. "This valley is a single holding," the first officer said aloud, more to himself than to us. "Divided into surface-use parcels, but titled together." She shook her head. "That can't be right." "It is," he replied. I stayed quiet. There's a moment in situations like this where silence becomes louder than argument. Every second she waited for someone to contradict him made the truth harder to ignore. She tried another angle. "My house is on the ridge," she said. "That's completely separate." The officer zoomed out on the map. "It isn't," he said calmly. "Your home sits on a long-term ground lease." Her mouth opened slightly. Closed again. "That land," he continued, rotating the screen so she could see, "is part of the same title." She leaned forward, squinting at the map like proximity alone could change it. "No," she said. "I bought my house." "You bought the structure," the officer corrected. "Not the land beneath it." The distinction hit her like a sudden drop in elevation. "That's impossible," she said. "I pay property taxes." You pay improvement taxes, he replied. The land taxes go to the title holder. The second officer finally looked at her directly. Do you know who that is? She didn't answer, because she already knew. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away again, as if refusing to complete the thought would somehow stop it from becoming real. The officer turned the tablet toward me. Sir, he said, this shows the entire valley under your ownership, including the ground lease parcels. I nodded. That's correct. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. So you're saying, she said slowly, that not only is his cabin legal, but he owns the land under my house? The officer didn't soften it. Yes. The valley went quiet again. No wind this time. No birds. Just the sound of her breathing changing as confidence gave way to calculation. This is insane, she said. No one ever told us this. That's not uncommon, the officer replied. Ground leases can last generations. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, pacing a short line in the gravel. So what does that mean? She asked. It means, the officer said, that he's not trespassing. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped herself, because there was nowhere left to go. She'd called the police, expecting removal. Instead, she'd summoned confirmation. And the cabin? She asked quietly. The officer glanced at my documents again. Permitted. Inspected. Pre-existing. Her shoulders sagged. She looked around the valley differently now, not as something shared, but as something owned. Defined. Bounded by lines she'd never bothered to see. I just wanted it gone, she muttered. The officer met her eyes. Calling the police doesn't make things illegal, he said. It just makes them visible. She said nothing, and in that silence, the weight of what she'd done finally settled. Because she hadn't just called the cops on a cabin. She'd called them on the owner of the valley, and the house she lived in. And the realization was only halfway finished. The officers didn't rush to conclude anything. They didn't need to. Once ownership is established, everything else becomes procedural. The drama drains out of the situation, replaced by quiet inevitability. And that shift unsettled her more than shouting ever could. She tried to recover. So, what now? She asked, forcing steadiness into her voice. I mean, I still had a right to call. I was concerned. The first officer nodded. You always have the right to call. Then he added, carefully, that doesn't mean there aren't consequences when the call is unfounded. Her jaw tightened. I didn't lie, she said. I believed it was illegal. Belief isn't the standard, the officer replied. Verification is. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, phone in hand, already documenting the encounter. Time stamps. Location. Nature of the complaint. Outcome. Paper trails don't raise their voices. They just last. She watched him typing and finally seemed to understand that this wasn't going away the moment the patrol cars left. I want this noted, she said quickly, that I was cooperative. The officer looked up. It will be. That wasn't the reassurance she wanted. He turned to me. Sir, he said, do you want to file anything regarding the complaint or the manner in which it was made? I considered it. Not emotionally. Practically. I looked at her, really looked this time. Not as an adversary, not as a villain. Just as someone who had lived comfortably inside an assumption for so long that she never imagined the ground beneath it mattered. Yes, I said. I'd like it documented. She flinched. For the record, I continued calmly, I don't want charges. I want clarity. The officer nodded. Understood. Clarity cuts deeper anyway. They asked her a few more questions. Why she thought the cabin was new, who told her it was illegal, whether she'd contacted anyone else about it before calling. Her answers grew shorter, less confident. She mentioned neighbors, rumors, a conversation years ago at a meeting she couldn't quite place. None of it held weight. Ma'am, the officer said finally, calling law enforcement to resolve property disputes, especially without verification, isn't appropriate. She looked down at the gravel. I didn't know. You didn't ask, he corrected. That distinction mattered. They explained that the incident would be logged as an unfounded trespass complaint. No citation. No charge, but a record. One that would surface if this pattern repeated. Her shoulders slumped. "And the cabin?" she asked one last time, almost hopefully. The officer shook his head. "It's legal. And it's staying." Silence settled again, heavier than before. She nodded once, stiffly. "Fine." The officers wrapped up their notes and began walking back up the path. Before leaving, one of them turned back to me. "If you have any further issues," he said, "contact us directly." I thanked them. They left the valley the same way they'd entered it, quietly, without ceremony.
She didn't follow.
She stood there for a long moment after they were gone, looking out over the land like it had shifted shape. "This doesn't feel right," she said finally. I met her gaze. "Ownership often doesn't," I replied. "Until you respect it." She said nothing more. She turned and walked back up the trail toward the ridge, toward a house she now understood in a very different way. I stayed by the cabin, listening to the wind return to the trees. The valley hadn't changed. Only her understanding of it had. And that understanding was about to follow her home. A few days passed before I heard anything else. No more complaints. No more visits. No sudden concerns about zoning or access. The valley settled back into its normal rhythm, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for years. That's how land reacts when boundaries are finally respected. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't need to. Silence, in situations like this, isn't avoidance, it's acknowledgement. She knew where things stood now. And more importantly, so did everyone else. Word travels quickly in places like this. By the end of the week, I noticed small changes. People waved where they hadn't before. A truck that used to idle too close to the access road started parking farther back. Conversations stopped when I passed, not out of hostility, but recalibration. They were adjusting. Not to me, exactly. To reality. I had the survey markers refreshed and the access routes clearly posted. Not aggressively. Not with warnings. Just with facts. Lines in the earth tend to speak louder than letters ever could. The cabin remained untouched. No vandalism. No anonymous notes. No concerned citizen calls. The system had spoken, and it had done so in a language everyone understood. As for her, I saw her once more from a distance on the ridge. She stood near her porch, looking down into the valley like someone rereading a familiar story and realizing they'd skipped a chapter. We didn't wave. We didn't need to. Some understandings don't require acknowledgement to be permanent. I made a point of reviewing every ground lease in the valley after that. Not to intimidate. To clarify. People deserve to know where they stand, especially when assumptions have quietly replaced facts for too long.
Most were surprised.
Some were uncomfortable. A few were grateful. None argued. Because documentation has a way of ending debates before they start. The valley felt different after that. Not tense. Not triumphant. Just settled. Like a place that had finally been named correctly. Ownership isn't about control. It's about responsibility. And responsibility doesn't announce itself. It just holds. I didn't build the cabin to make a statement. I restored it because it belonged there, because history doesn't vanish just because someone forgets to look it up. The valley had always been whole. People had just convinced themselves it wasn't. That illusion broke the moment she called the police expecting power and instead received perspective. She never called again. No one did. And every time I walk past the cabin now, I'm reminded of something simple and easily forgotten. The loudest authority in any place isn't the person who shouts. It's the one who owns the ground beneath everyone's feet. And doesn't need to say a word about it.